All right, welcome back. We are talking about art in the age of mass media this week. So we're going to set the stage a little bit and then dig into some topics. Um, we're moving into the 1920s and 30s, and the industrialization of photography is reaching whole new levels with the expansion of newspapers, magazines of all different kinds. Some that are general interest, some that are special interest, like more niche publications. And then, of course, you have the professional publications, periodicals, and journals and the like. Now, all of these different types of publications were using the new photomechanical methods of reproducing images. Remember, we talked about how it's now fast, easy, and cheaper to actually print photographs. So some of the other things that are happening around this time in tandem with photography moving forward and expanding dramatically, you have what they called the automatic photo machine. What we call it today is the photo booth. That was patented and set up in New York at first and became very popular and kind of spread across the United States from there. Now, you've all probably done a photo booth before. Some of them are in bars, some of them are in shops or malls. Sometimes they'll have them set up at weddings or special events, and it automatically takes your picture and either prints out a photo strip or they send you a digital copy or something like that. That was becoming really popular around that time. Outside of the advancement of photography, by 1920, there's about 10 million cars registered in the United States, and automobile production was becoming one of the nation's leading industries. So you can see how industrialization is not just affecting photography, but now we have cars and people are becoming more mobile and able to move around. Now, obviously, not everyone can afford a car, but those that can, it's now easier for them to go longer distances in a quicker amount of time. And then we also get the telephone. So in 1900, there were 1 million telephones in the United States, and by 1920, there were 7.5 million. So 7 times that in 20 years. So we can see that the nation is becoming electrified, it's becoming wired, and more homes are also able to have radios in them so they could listen to radio programming at home for the first time. Before in-home radio, there would be places you could go in public to listen to something like this, but eventually, like the telephone in the car, it became more accessible to more people. If we're looking at the different art movements happening around this time, you have photographic realism, which was associated with the events that happened during World War I, which we didn't touch on in lecture, but it was discussed in your textbook. And after World War I, there's all this psychological devastation that sort of drove artists to want to create more experimental, non-linear, non-narrative artwork. And so people started making more abstract images that challenged the more clear subject matter that had come before. So before we're taking a very straightforward documentary portrait of someone, now you're seeing some abstraction coming in. We'll dig into that in a little bit here. You'll see that the artists that we're going to talk about today are using very strange shapes and planes and shadows, and all of these types of things sort of perplexed and confused viewers who were so used to the simple understanding of the more realistic images that came before. So it was a new way of consuming images too, and a new way of thinking about how we look and understand, how we look at and understand photographs and art in general. And experimental art also wasn't just happening in gallery spaces. Artists started making these more avant-garde publications to kind of spread their ideas and their works to a greater audience. And this was possible for them because of these, the halftone process and these different new photomechanical methods of reproducing photographs. So that sort of gets us sets the stage for us today. So we've discussed photographers all throughout the course so far who have been dabbling in early photojournalism, but it really wasn't until the 1920s that with this proliferation of mass market illustrated journals that the word photojournalism actually became a term that was used. Right? You remember me saying like, oh, this is an example of early photojournalism, but we don't have that word yet. We get that word in the 20s. So images in all of these publications being disseminated across, every country across the world, they're inescapable at this point. They're everywhere, and the presence of this photomechanical illustration really influenced a lot of art movements, especially in Europe, and we'll talk about those specifically today as well. Prior to this time, artists and photographers had thought that they thought really negatively about mass media, newspapers, and magazines and things like that. They thought that they didn't help people. But there's this new generation of artists and photographers who really see potential in this medium to not only convey visual excitement, but also to communicate their ideas through images instead of just words. Now, the image we have on the screen here is from the cover of the Illustrated Berlin newspaper, which started in 1890, but ended up getting redesigned a few times so that it could accommodate more and more photographic images as it became faster, easier, and cheaper to do this. So this publication was commonly referred to as BIZ, B-I-Z, Berlin Illustrated Newspaper, but Zeitung is a newspaper in German. And it was one of the very first of the illustrated publications to share what's called the photo essay with its readers. And because of the success of this publication, all the other illustrated publications in the world started to copy the design and the layout and the methods of circulation that the BIZ journal was using. And so, as I said, there's all of these different types of illustrated publications circling around, and of course it doesn't take too long for politically aligned publications to surface for both the left and the right and everything in between. So there's these different political publications that are being created specifically to critique capitalism and communicate the different ideas and promote the causes of their specific parties. Now, with so many new illustrated publications coming out, and with how quickly they could now change the images in them, between World War I and World War II, the average person in the industrialized nations would see so many more photographs than anyone in the 19th century. The difference, though, and this is key, is that in the early 20th century, we're not seeing original prints. You're seeing photomechanical reproductions in newspapers and magazines. Before the 20th century, the images that could be considered mass manufactured, like carte de visite or stereographs, those are chosen by you, right? You would go and choose which cartes you wanted to buy of like a political figure or a theater star or your friends, family, etc. Same thing for the stereographs. You would choose which scenes you wanted. If you wanted the series on Niagara Falls and the series on Shakespeare's Hamlet, you would go and make those selections yourself, and then you would organize it and curate it into your personal album, and you would look at it over and over and over again. The newspaper and magazine images that were becoming almost ubiquitous in the early 20th century were not selected by you, the viewer, for your personal collection. They're selected by photo editors or advertising designers and then circulated to the public for a brief time and then replaced by new images. So your image experience is now being curated for you by someone else, as opposed to you deciding what your image consumption is. So because of all these newspapers and magazines, photographers had way more outlets for photographs, and they could represent a very wide range of political positions. And then what's happening to the viewers during this time is that with all of these images being thrown at them, it makes them more sophisticated in how they look at and consume these images. So also, when something becomes so prolific and so ubiquitous, you start to think of it as more disposable, right? So if you got an illustrated newspaper, it wouldn't have the same sort of preciousness as a carte de visite or a stereograph would, that you had chosen specifically for your collection. So you might be more likely to not keep that illustrated newspaper. You might look through it a couple of times or even only once and then throw it away. So there's, not only are we becoming more sophisticated viewers around this time, but we're also now this what was so precious about photography in its early years, that specialness of that image is not a part of these images that are being photomechanically reproduced. And this is a Leica camera. The Leica camera was developed before World War I, and it was originally used to test movie film, and then was introduced to on a consumer grade level in about 1924. The great thing about the Leica camera is that it used the new roll film, which was much faster than any film that came before, and they were continually improving constantly throughout the 20th century until the sort of the moment when digital took over. The older and larger cameras still would render much more detail in images since the negatives were larger. So some photographers, I should say most photographers, still preferred this method of photographing. And there are a lot of photographers who still work with those large format cameras today for the same reasons, because the big 8x10 or 4x5 cameras, that film can render so much more detail, more so than you can get on any digital camera. Because when you're working with digital, you're using data and pixels, and data and pixels cannot capture the same thing as the light sensitive material embedded in this film. But even though you still have photographers who were using the larger cameras, there was this desire to mimic the spontaneous look that was made by the more fashionable small cameras. Not to mention, it's probably way easier to carry around, a Leica like this and other versions of this, other brands, I should say, of this camera. It's easier, it's quicker, it's portable, and so some folks who weren't necessarily interested in the quality of their photograph were fine with working this way, just for the ease of it. And then I have here, just for fun, it's a little timeline of how the Leica kind of evolved from 1914 up until, I think the last one on there is 2012 or something. But this brand still exists. It's been, over 100 years now. They're still around. They're still making cameras. I think their most recent one was a mirrorless digital or something. So they're also kind of a luxury brand now. It's a very expensive camera if you have a Leica. So anyways, these smaller cameras, like I said, they lead to candid photography, and that phrase, candid photography, was first used to describe the work that Erich Salomon was doing. Now, Salomon had many social and political connections in Germany and throughout Europe. And what this meant was that he was in these inner circles that were having a lot of meetings and secret conferences and dealings that weren't available to the public. Like these conversations were very exclusive, very elite. And so he didn't his beliefs didn't necessarily align with how secretive they were being about these meetings. So what he would do is he would hide little cameras, either in his hat or in his jacket or something, so that he could take photographs in these rooms without anyone knowing he had a camera on him. So his use of secret cameras allowed him to make images where no one knew he was photographing. That means you can ensure that your image is going to be like truthful and candid, right? If you have a camera on you and you whip it out, everyone's going to act differently because we all perform for a camera, right? If we know there's a camera present, we're going to change our behavior. It's just how humans work. So by hiding these cameras and being secretive with it, there's this certain truthfulness that couldn't have possibly been captured if his subjects had known that he was sporting a camera, right? So his images, like the one here, were published in the Berlin Illustrated newspaper and emphasize the importance of the public's right to see behind the scenes of important political issues. So I have a link to share with you here. Let me find it. Give me 1 second. Okay. There we go. Okay, so this is a link to the ICP, and they have a whole section on Eric Solomon. They give you a little background on him and then all of his different photographs. So, obviously he shot non-candid photographs as well, but there's a lot of, I think they have, a lot of his images from the Berlin Illustrated magazine newspaper, and then some of his candids. I mean, it just goes on. So feel free to scroll through this at your leisure and see if there's anything that kind of grabs you there. But I just wanted to, there's always archives of everyone's works online. So let me get back to our, okay, hold on. Let me get back to our slideshow and we can continue. All right. So around the same time, tabloids start to emerge, similar to the ones we know today, like the National Enquirer, Life and Style, In Touch, OK. These are all things that you would see in the checkout at the grocery store, the Walgreens, or something like that. So historically, tabloids would use mostly pictures with very little text, or similar to the sort of exclamations you see here, like torn between two lovers, did he cheat, you forced William to cheat, like I don't know. But anyways, it was all these big flashy photographs, and this would sort of sensationalize the images that were shown to pique the interest of the audience. There's always images of crime and violence, candid celebrity shots, spectacular disaster photographs, and tabloids were really easy for people to pick up on their way to work, and with very little text in them, they could look through them really quickly to get the sensational news from the large images. Now, here's an example of the Daily News. Was one of the most circulated illustrated newspapers in the United States, and this particular newspaper encouraged its photographers to get images by any means possible. Like, they gave them free rein to be crazy and do whatever they had to do. So the image here from the Daily News is one of the execution of Ruth Snyder. And the story, she's sitting in the electric chair, which is quite startling for, early 19th century. It's startling for any time. Like, even though we're like sort of desensitized to a lot today, I think like if someone were to publish a photograph of someone in the electric chair getting executed in a newspaper, we would all kind of be like, oh my God, like they're showing that? Like, wow. So the story behind Ruth is that she murdered her husband. She had been having an affair with a married corset salesman who sort of helped her plan the murder of her husband. But the sort of odd thing about this is that they tried to kill him 7 times before they actually succeeded. And then, of course, they got caught. So that's just a fun fact for you. But there's this photographer called Tom Howard, and what he did was he put a hidden camera on his ankle, and he took this picture of her right before she was, or actually just as she was being electrocuted in the chair. And so this is an example of a very extreme photograph being taken, but all the photographers were in competition with each other, right? So you had to have the most sensational images if you were to get something published. It's, pretty similar to today, except most newspapers don't really have actual photographers on staff anymore. They just give their journalists iPhones. So, but still, if someone has a better picture than you, they're going to use that. Many people from the time these sort of tabloids started found this level of sensationalism in the photographs to be really distasteful. And they also thought it was an exploitation of the illiterate. And we have to talk about what that means, because this is kind of key here. They're providing very easy to consume images to everyone with very little accompanying text, so that anyone, even those that could not read, could look at quickly. But they weren't always sharing the most important events that were happening in the world. Rather, they were sharing the most sensational events that would sell newspapers and draw an audience, right? I've said this over and over, like it's about money, right? So you also have to think about like the tabloids that we see at the checkout at the grocery and what kind of things appear in there to catch your attention, right? It's often like celebrity gossip that 9 times out of 10, or I should say 11 times out of 10, is not true, right? Or something about aliens, or something about the current president. So all of that is sensationalism, and so folks who couldn't read would see these sensational images, and that's the news they're getting. They're not getting news of anything else that's going on, whether it's important or not. But that's a really important point to make about these illustrated newspapers and their levels of sensationalism being disseminated to the public. So next, I want to talk about revolutionary art, the Soviet photograph. So in Russia, the revolution of 1917, which placed the socialists in power, it had a really deep impact on artists, particularly the avant-garde artists. And if you're unsure of what avant-garde means, it's basically a fun way to say experimental or new or unusual. That would be a good word to try to start incorporating into your vocabulary if you don't already. And this is where we're going to start talking about abstraction. And abstraction becomes this symbol for the future, separate from the past. So artists were experimenting with cubism and futurism. We talked about that last week. 2 weeks ago, responding to the Communist Party's ideas of utopianism. So the first photographer I want to talk about is El Lissitzky, and he's an architect and a photographer. His work is very politically charged, and also he sort of works in this way where the artist, to him, the role of the artist is very much linked to industry and reshaping everyday life. In the avant-garde circles, they would use these terms called production art or production artist, and they would use them to indicate that the artist was using technology to make a new society. And technology for them at that time is photography, the camera, this tech, right? And photography was the most favored method of working because it was just that. A camera is a product of a machine that can be mass produced by other machines. So this is probably his most popular or famous pieces of art. It's called The Constructor from 1924, and it's it's a self-portrait. So you can see Elle's face there in the middle. He's using a lot of those sort of planes and geometric overlays, which a lot of the Russian avant-garde image makers would use. They also commonly would integrate again the planes. They make the image very flat, right? Like there's not a lot of dimension in this image, but it's flattened on purpose, basically because all of the sort of paintings and even photographs that came before this period in time were very focused on deep, realistic perspectives. If you think about Renaissance paintings that almost feel like you can enter into them because of how deep the perspective is, they're doing the exact opposite in the way they're making these photographs and also other ways of making art at this time. They're very in their head, they're making it flat on purpose because they're moving away from the old and towards the new future. So normally if we were in class, I would ask you to tell me what you see in this image, but we're not doing it that way right now. So let's look at all the different things that are happening within this image. So first of all, you have the portrait of the artist himself. And I should say that this image overall is made from 6 different exposures. It explicitly highlights his eye in the center. And that's important because insight is passed through the eye and transmitted to the hand, and through it to the tools of production. He's holding a compass, right? So eye, hand, tool, all right there for you. And the compass is drawing this circle around his head, which if you were to continue that circle all the way around to the other side, it would kind of look like a halo, right? Which is a symbol that's very prominent in Russian religious paintings. And some would say that he had sort of sainted himself. But there's other ways of reading that as well, which I'll get to in a moment. But he's also layering those geometric shapes, graph paper, signs. He's using printer type, the XYZ. You could say that the compass drawing that circle is generating movement towards the future. And that XYZ cutting into it is the end. It's the end of the alphabet, the end of the past, and there's an arrow pushing forward to the future. So all of these different things would emerge as primary elements in Soviet poster design and magazine illustrations, which, here I should go to the next slide, which Lissitzky was a part of creating designs demonstrating Soviet industrial progress. So these are some of the early, more avant-garde Soviet propaganda posters that they were using around that time. So there were also a lot of Soviet artists who were in tandem with being, a printmaker, a painter, a photographer. They were writers and theorists addressing national and international audiences. So they're making not only artwork to express themselves, but also for their country in the manner of art posters like these. Next we have Gustav Klutzis. He used what's called photomontage to construct these kind of iconic representations of his subjects. So when we talk about the word montage, it means to layer meaning, and it compels the viewer to kind of reconsider the world marking a conceptual shift in the understanding of what a picture can be. So photomontage is this assembling of images from a variety of mass media sources, such as newspapers and magazines. It's important to note that the way that the Russian photographers were working with photomontages, they're using current images. So everything is there's nothing referencing like history necessarily. It's all current events, current political events mostly. And the result really changed the expectations of everyday experience and pulled people away from realistic painting into these what is often described as an image collision, because you're using all of these different media sources and clippings to build this new image. So Gustav really strove to make his images understandable even by those who were illiterate. So you won't see a ton of text in his works. Other folks will use text more, but like the illustrated newspapers, these types of photomontages were intended to be accessible to the masses. And even, I would say, up until the 1970s and 80s, there was still a very large portion of the United States, Russia, I should just say the world, that couldn't read, right? So a lot of these artists are working towards accessibility to the best of their ability. And in this photo montage here, you can see the giant man there, that's Vladimir Lenin, and he Gustav Klusis has him walking into the future. You can see this very big modernist building being constructed, and there's like these tiny people, these workers building this building, and they're cheering him on. So again, we're moving into the future in almost every single one of these pieces that we're looking at. And that's, again, very important for this time because they wanted to be completely separate from the past. Next, we have Alexandchenko. He was very significant and took up this idea of working with revolutionary art. He starts off as a Russian painter and sculptor, working kind of in this cubist style with geometric abstractions, but he also got really into doing collage, which your book and most history sources will say collage was started by the cubists before World War I. This is false. Collage was invented by women in the 19th century. And I think I come back to this in a minute. Let me just make sure in my notes because I don't want to skip over it. Okay, yeah, I have it later. Well, I'll go on my rant about them always saying that white men invented photo collage later. So anyways, he has a lot of political activity. He likes to investigate the role that art might play in society, and he wanted to make art that was less theoretical and more practical. So he decided to work in photography because he felt that photography was separate from other media, right? Separate from painting, separate from sculpture, and it had different aesthetic ideas, and you didn't necessarily have to use the rules from painting or drawing or sculpture that have been established for hundreds, thousands of years. Especially topics like perspective and other techniques used to render the world as it is rather than as it might be. And he also felt that if you're going to be talking about the future and new concepts, that you shouldn't use old media, you should use new media. So obviously at this time, the new media and the technology is photography. There's this term called factura, F-A-K-T-U-R-A. Your book touches on it briefly. And this is an idea that's very prominent in Soviet art theory, that an artist should discover a medium's distinctive capabilities by experimenting with its inherent qualities. That's a direct quote. And this is something that Rodchenko was a leading supporter of. Now, This photo montage here was made in 1923. Rodchenko had gathered images from all the illustrated newspapers. He also commissioned some photographs from another photographer to include in his photo montage here. And he put all of the images together to make this photo montage. And there were several others in this series that would accompany Mayakovsky's poem Pro Ito, which is about this. And this image is very interesting to look at, and there's a lot going on. But think about people who had never seen something like this before. How would they react? You're so used to just seeing, straightforward photographs, or like the craziest it's gotten up to this point is the pictorialists making things kind of fuzzy. But even the pictorialists were working in this way that was understood because you're looking at it in the same way you look at a painting. Whereas these types of images, there's no certainty with how to approach them. So where would people start to unpack what's happening in this image and all of its symbolic meanings that exist here? And that's the question that comes up. And I always sort of say, just start by unpacking one thing at a time. Like these particular, if this was like a more advanced course, I would have you actually do a deep read of one of these where you make a list of each item that's in this, sorry, I just lost my words there, that's in this photo montage. So like you would start a list and you would say spoons, man holding spoons, mirror, man holding spoons in mirror. There's a beer stein. There's man in a chair. You would just, there's a knife, all these things. You would list them all out, including the sort of color planes in the background. And then you kind of go through and at first you decide what they mean to you symbolically. And then you do a little research into the symbolism of these things. And also, of course, you have to look into the political situation of the time because this is all relevant in that setting. And then you can kind of go through that and be like, okay, so this is how these all relate together, and this is the meaning that's embedded here. So that's kind of it's definitely like a close reading of an image, and it takes time to do, but that's sort of how you have to approach these. Now, these are historic for us, so if they're being read in 1923, you're going to like recognize all these people right away, and you don't necessarily have to do as much research because all these images are coming through mass media, so everyone has access to them, and so it's easier to create meaning when it's of your time and of your moment. But historically, to unpack some of these, it might be a little tricky to do just at first glance. But, some of these photo montages seem kind of whimsical. There's sometimes text put in them, and a lot of Rodchenko's photographs from the 1920s, 30s onward, they really shed light on this rapid social and industrial transformation of the Soviet Union. And that's really important to remember about, a lot of the work that we're looking at right now. So let's go on to the next thing. So the post-revolutionary Russian avant-garde really advocated making images in a way that would kind of obstruct your habits of seeing, right? Because we have a way that we understand how to look at things, especially people in the early 20th century, because there was really only one way to look at things up until this point. And there were rules for how you looked at things, and you understood how to look at images. So now you have these new artists who want to challenge the way that you see things, and they felt that people had become too accustomed to looking at images in a certain way, and they wanted to shake it up. So they would on purpose use strange camera angles. They would get really close to things. They would do multiple exposures like the El Lissitzky photo we were just looking at, and they would confuse perspective. Like this one here, we're kind of on top of this gentleman and he looks weirdly stretched out, and then there's the shadows coming in. So on purpose, they wanted to make these images look strange. And create this sort of unexpected experience of the world. Now, once Rodchenko learned how to make his own photographs, he moved from photomontage to straight photography, but he was still using the make strange that we just talked about. And you can see that here, like looking at this image, it's difficult to tell what's happening here, or what this object is. But if we keep in mind that, you know, it's about obstructing our way of looking at things and challenging how our brain sort of function and wraps around an image like this, then, you know, eventually we can get there. So eventually by the 1930s, the Soviet government kind of loses interest in the experimental and avant-garde way of seeing through images, and they go back to promoting Soviet realism to send out their propaganda messages, because they felt that some of the more avant-garde and abstract things that were being done by Lissitzky and others weren't as easily understood and interpreted. So they were trying to simplify things for the audience. I don't know that I have an opinion on what worked better at that time, but the government decided to move away from using those avant-garde artists and back to like more realistic representations. But the artists themselves kept working in these ways of making strange. The next section / movement is Dada, and that's kind of a weird thing. And Dada means, well, I shouldn't say means. Part of the meaning of Dada is this discontent with violence and war and nationalism. So during World War I, there's this group of artists and writers and poets, and they meet at this cafe in Zurich, Switzerland. And Switzerland, as you probably know, is a politically neutral country. And this whole group of folks who are meeting at this cafe were very much opposed to war and to the materialism that is driving, you know, consumption during this time. And so they wanted to make new art that kind of expressed their discontent and their despair, but that would also sort of do away with some of the more tiresome conventions and intellectual barriers that existed in the present art world. So what they were after is they wanted to create these more satirical and nonsensical works. They rejected things like logic and reason and aestheticism, you know, that was running so rampant in modern capitalist society, and instead they expressed nonsense, irrationality, and they had these sort of anti-bourgeois protests in their works. And so they were sort of like the bad art kids who were against everything, but it's an exciting movement. So let's kind of dig into that. So we have Tristan Tzara. I love this picture of him because no one wears monocles anymore, and he has this lovely monocle on his eyeball. But he wrote the Dada Manifesto in 1918, and he was sort of, the summation of that is that he felt like they had to do this work of destruction with their art. And I'm going to post the PDF of the Dada Manifesto so you can read it on the Blackboard. But the sort of origins for the name Dada stem from this moment when there's two of these folks in the cafe take a knife and they stick it into a French-German dictionary, and when they looked where it was pointing to, it pointed to Dada, which means several different things depending on the language. Hobby horse is one meaning of it. They also chose it because it sounds like nonsense, like Dada, you know. So it also, well, there's two reasons they probably chose it. So because it sounds like nonsense, but also because of all the different meanings. So it means hobby horse in French, yes in Romanian, there in German, et cetera, et cetera. So through the visual arts and also performances and publications, Dada sort of accentuates the disruptiveness of these sort of chance collisions, so photo montage, of images and sounds. So they're working in all of these more contemporary media, using photography and early film, but also sound, and not necessarily music, but sound. Next, we have Christian Schad. He was a German artist who was part of the Dada group in Zurich, and he was sort of influenced by the idea of emphasizing the need to be to step away from traditional ways of composing images, right? I've been talking about this the whole time, like moving into the future, away from the past and past ways of seeing things. So what he would do is create these small collages, using just newspaper clippings, things that were laying around, and he would make these abstract photographs. Essentially, he's making photograms here. So what he would do is take his light sensitive paper and lay the objects on top of it, expose it to a light or to the sun, and then here we have what Tristan Tzara referred to as shadographs here, because it's Christian Schad, so shadographs, but it also sounds a lot like the shadographs created by more early photographers like Talbot. But what Tzara was doing here is just sort of a play on words, which is something that the Dadaists also did. And he's hinting at the fact that the word Schaden in German meant damaged. And this alludes to the Dada sense of things falling apart. And there's just something kind of wonderful about these shadographs or simply photograms, if you want to call them by what they actually are. This one in particular looks like I always think it's like a horse in a tutu spinning around, but if you change the orientation of the image, or if you're looking at it from a different perspective, it could be all sorts of things. So again, it's a perfect example of how you're challenging the way we look at and view things. So the Dadaists in Berlin adopted photomontage as a very key medium. Sometimes when they would make their photomontage, and in German it's called a Klebebild, or a paste picture, they would make the original with all the cut pieces glued on, but then they would photograph it before it went to like an exhibition, or before it was published in any zine or newspaper or publication in general. So it would give it a much more finished look, and then it could be reproduced over and over and over. And there were all of these different publications that the Dadaists did. They actually have a really wonderful collection at the Art Institute of the Dadaist publications and the Surrealist publications, which we'll get to in a minute. So if you ever have the chance to go there, you can ask to view those, and it's pretty fascinating to see how the early publications kind of look very similar to avant-garde publications being made today. But anyways, this is Hannah Hock. She was one of the earliest Dadaists to make images using the photomontage, and this is one of her more famous photomontages here. It's called Cut with the Kitchen Knife, Dada Through the Last Weimar Beer Belly, Cultural Epoch of Germany. And there's a lot going on here. Sorry, I just needed a drink of water. So the diversity of mass media sources in the picture testifies to how many newspapers and journals were circulating in the years after World War I. And we're really falling into a visual culture, right? As I've said, all of these artists are using contemporary clippings from illustrated publications. Like, none of this is old. They're making current political statements through these montages. So the fact that you can find this many images in publications to allow you to build such a strong message through your photo montages is kind of incredible in 1919, right? I think today it might be really tricky for us to find this many images, just because we've gone so far in this digital direction that we sort of consume all of our news and politics and communication online or on our phones. And yes, there are still newspapers and magazines being made, but like you'd probably have to go spend $30 to get enough material to make something as sort of impactful as what you see here. Or alternatively, I guess today we could print off images from the internet, and that would be kind of a similar way of working, or to do a digital photo montage in Photoshop, pulling and sourcing your images from the digital media. But I'm getting off track here. So in the center of this image, you can see a dancer beneath the head of Kata Kollwitz, and she's a famous printmaker, German printmaker around this time. And the head has been speared by a man standing in front of an elephant, and the dancer's right foot rests on this giant ball bearing. And beneath that is this young revolutionary sailor who's saying Traité Dada Bay, which is join Dada. And the word Dada is kind of scattered throughout this work. But what she's doing here is it looks confusing, but the times were confusing. So she's sort of emphasizing, through the photo montage, this rapid movement, sense of confusion and discontent, and it's a nonsense narrative, right? So even though the individual images, if we were to unpack this, how I sort of, outlined it earlier by pulling out each piece, even though the individual images within these early photo montages were easy to read, their combination creates pictures whose meaning was much more difficult to decipher. But photo montage itself was this message of change and moving forward, and moving forward rapidly too. So very much like the American photographer Frances Benjamin Johnston, who we've looked at, Hannah Höcht really liked to use this theme of the new woman. And so she would do these collages of contemporary women in different social roles, and she would use symbols of modernity to make her the new woman, whether it's a car or machinery or the electric light bulb, which was new. But she was always sort of after this criticism of contemporary politics and society's hypocrisy towards women as both workers and sexual objects. But her compositions, while critical, have a certain lightness to them that, it makes you sort of feel more optimistic. And she's not trying to be super dark about it. She's just trying to be very realistic and critical, because that's what we're doing with this art. But she's also, you can see the joy that she has when she's making these collages. Other things that she was working on, in the 1930s, she would collage pictures of objects in German ethnographic collections with other symbols of modernism. So the point that she's trying to make with these is, to combine this Western materialism and non-Western traditional practices. So she's critiquing that divide that's been created, that we're talking about throughout this class as well. And so her series, From an Ethnographic Museum, really kind of produces some unsettling effects by how she's juxtaposing both male and female body parts with non-Western sculptures. And then, of course, I have one more here to share with you. These particular collages are moving more into what we might describe as surrealism, which is a topic coming up soon in this conversation. But the one on the left with the face of the man on the bird wings following this collage, gentleman, who seems to be walking off a cliff, is just something of a nightmare. But anyways, I just like to share as much of her work as possible, because she was one of the only female Dadaists at that time. So Hannah Höcht, her partner was Raoul Hausmann. And he was one of the very few, he also has a monocle, but he was one of the few communists who insisted on women's equality in any new society. So he is one of the very few white men who, in this sort of process of moving to the future, separate from the past, is saying women come with on the same level as men. There's equality here for you. And he got a lot of shit for that. But you know, he was one of the few who really pushed for that. And this is one of his most famous photo montages. It's called Tatlin at Home. And this is another one where I would ask you in class, like, what do you think is going on in this one? But he would describe that he was adding machinery. In the gentleman's head here, there's a steering column from an automobile, and he wanted to show that this man had machines for brains. So the human mind controlled by rational, unemotional thought, which is what a machine is, right? There's no emotion involved there, and a machine is rational. And human minds are not always unemotional or rational. We can be very emotional and very irrational. So he's making a statement here by putting this machinery in this gentleman's head. And the man with the pockets turned out, what is that a symbol of? That's a symbol of poor, right? And so this man's turning out his pockets as a symbol that he has no money. And like many of the photo montages, Hausman also painted parts of the picture, like the background. So not always would every single thing be a snipping or a clipping from a newspaper. Sometimes they would go in with paint or drawing materials to sort of fill everything out here. Now, the original version of this, they say it's been destroyed, but it was stolen in transit from a museum. So, I mean, likely it's either hidden in someone's, basement, or it has been destroyed. But luckily, as I mentioned earlier, most of the photo collagists, montagists would take photographs of their work before. Sorry, I keep losing my train of thought. They would take photographs of their work so that they could have a record of it in case anything did happen. So here's another one of Hausman's photo montages. This one's a self-portrait. I really love this one. There's a lot of ways we can look at it. So the ABCD self-portrait, there's a lot of things happening. So underneath his face, to the left, if you're seeing this in the same way I am, there's the letters VOCE, which is Italian for voice, and that's sort of appearing right next to his open mouth, in which there's ABCD indicating, the beginning of the alphabet, right? So the beginning, and that's right next to this sort of oval shape of the cosmos, stars, outer space. There's also different tickets stuck in his cap that sort of, they're tickets from specifically the Kaiser Jubilee, which is an event in Germany. But it's sort of a symbol for empty formalities of the social milieu in which he functioned. And then, of course, you have, there's money, there's his name, you have this diagram of genitalia at the bottom where there's a man's hands being inserted into a woman. And then right next to that, there's two globes right next to a very phallic shape. So, he's not only is he making a statement about himself, but he's also making a statement about himself in the state of the world in which he exists. And again, we could unpack this for forever and find all these different meanings, but that's sort of the general gist of that. But he really was one of the leading men in the Berlin Dada art period. And all of this Dada work was a direct reaction to all of the horrors that everyone experienced during World War I. So again, just to recap a little about Dada, because I know it can be confusing. These Dada artists believe that the war was a direct result of capitalism and materialism. They wanted to encourage others to realize the faults in this conformity. And so the Dadaists were essentially mocking capitalist society with their irrational and illogical pieces, and they're questioning reality as a whole. So this time period is inspiring controversy and discovery and conflict between, dissatisfied people and their governments. And Dadaism itself attracted attention because of the unpredictable and unusual work of its artists. So through all of this like strangeness, the Dada art was specifically made to evoke these emotional responses from its audience. It was protesting the war and rejecting, the choices being made by the government at this time. So that kind of covers the Dada. Now, let's talk about photo montage and photo collage for a moment specifically. So photo collage started with the cut and paste work of the album makers, like Lady Filmer, and the combination printing of Oscar Raylander. But it's important that we emphasize that while your book says it was the Cubists and all of these white men, it was women. Victorian women were the inventors, if you will, of photo montage and photo collage. Now, they probably wouldn't have called it montage because that's a word that sort of means speed, and that comes later. But photo collage, in its original form, was made by these women who were working from home, and a lot of their work just doesn't get out there because women's place was in the home. Their place was not to be an artist and not to be making statements that went out to the public, but they still, as we discussed when we originally talked about Lady Filmer, she was still making like social and political comments through the collages that she was making, even though not many people got to see it. And there's, if you consider the very few women that we've talked about in the 19th century who were working, in any way, shape, or form, there's probably hundreds of others that we don't have access to see their work because it's in a private collection or a familial collection, or it's been destroyed because no one considered it to be valuable at that time. So that's my rant on women inventing photo collage. And then, of course, the reason I bring up Oscar Raylander is because he's doing combination printing and others like him. So that is a type of collage when you're using the different negatives to come together to build a larger image. That's collage as well. So I think we can kick photo collage all the way back to some of the early photographers that we've already talked about, and then maybe specifically ascribe montage to the Dadaists and their counterparts. So there's these anti-establishment photographic experiments that originate in both Soviet and German experimental photography that have very different social aims, obviously, from what we see in Raylander and Filmer's work. So this idea of the photo montage, the rapid succession of images, originated in Germany, but it was adopted in Russia shortly after World War I. And so this is repetitive. I've said this already, but I do like to repeat myself. So these experimental artists would cut the pictures from magazines and newspapers. They paste them together in these composite images. And then what's happening is this jumbled up scale, right? Some subjects, if you have people in your photo montage, some might be much larger than others and having this weird scale, very similar to what you see here, like that those little boys, or that one man is like way smaller than all the women. Something really poignant about that. But anyways, I'm getting off track. But the scale gets messed up, your perspective gets messed up, and it's, again, challenging the way that you're looking at something and understanding something. Collage itself comes from the French word for glue, which is just a fun fact. And then, as I said, the Dadaists, they started calling them photo collages and then eventually moved on to calling them specifically photo montages, as I said, because the word montage alludes to this rapid succession of images that indicates a change of place or a transition of ideas. And again, that's important because they want to separate from the past, move to the future. So we are changing place. We are transitioning into a new world in their mind. So that that's that. Next, I want to talk about Dada in Paris. So we were talking about Dada in Zurich, Switzerland. We were talking about Dada in Berlin, Germany. And now we're moving to Paris and what's happening there. So in Paris, the Dadaists who are working there, they want to separate themselves from the sort of extreme political activism happening with the Berlin group so that they can sort of focus on a wider cultural criticism. And it is in Paris that Marcel Duchamp, seen here playing chess against himself, he draws a mustache and a little beard on a photographic reproduction of the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. And he relabels it with a title that is actually, what would you call it? Like profanity in French. So in French, it actually means she's hot in the arse. And but what Duchamp's translation was intended to be is there's fire down below. So the masculinized female introduces this theme of gender reversal, which was really popular with Duchamp, who actually had his own female pseudonym, Rose C'est la Vie, which is pronounced Eros C'est la Vie. I don't speak French, so that probably is not the right way to say it, but in English it means Eros, that's life. And here you can see Marcel Duchamp as his alter ego, Rose C'est la Vie, here. And this was a common thing for people to do forever, I guess. Like there's, everyone had their alter egos that they would share in certain ways with the world. So that's Marcel Duchamp, and his you could consider his version of the Mona Lisa to also be a method of collage or change in perspective on how you view something, right? Then we have Max Ernst. So before he came to Paris and met with the Dadaists there, he was already making some really, I don't consider them psychologically disturbing, but some folks would describe them that way. I'll let you decide. But his work is, sometimes it's clippings, but it's often he does drawings and paintings, and his stuff is sort of bridging this gap between the Dadaist and the Surrealist movement. And so his stuff is more like eerie, feels like a dream sometimes, or a nightmare, or a weird memory from your subconscious, and those things kind of describe more accurately Surrealist works of art. But I'll get to that in a minute. Here's another one of his that's more of a photo collage that he's done here. But basically, some of the Dadaists were tired, as I said earlier, of this political activism. They wanted to start thinking in a different way. So they moved to Paris, away from the overly political groups in Germany, to do so. And this kind of leads into, it overlaps with the development of this of the Surrealist movement, which was born in Paris in the mid-1920s, and it was different than Dada. We have André Breton here, who wrote the Surrealist Manifesto. All these movements had manifestos. So as I said earlier, the Dadaists, Tristan Tzara wrote the manifesto, and then the Surrealists, André Breton wrote the manifesto, which I will also put on the blackboard for you to read so that you can kind of see the similarities and differences between the two. So he published that on October 15th, 1924, and this is a direct quote that he announced the primacy of the rational and the belief in the truth beyond realism, and that's putting it mildly. But Surrealism was essentially rooted in Freud's theory of the unconscious and the methods that he would propose for revealing a person's unconscious desires, most notably dream analysis, free association, sequences of words and ideas. But really it was about sort of accessing the inaccessible parts of your mind, which is the subconscious. So rather than emphasizing a social change like on a large level, like a state level or a countrywide level, the surrealists were moving for something like a transformation of human perception and experience, and getting in touch with their imagination and their inner mind. So that's really everything to them. I think I brought it up earlier, but dreams, the unconscious, the imagination, and of course, photography was central to the surrealist practice. In theory, at least, making photographs could be the visual equivalent of free association, and other methods of kind of getting around your rational mind. So you'll sort of see how they applied that as we talk about some of the different surrealist artists going along here. So before we dig in, I always like to show a surrealist film. It's called Un Chien Andalou, which in English is an Andalusian dog. And it's just a good introduction, so you kind of get an idea of what to expect if you haven't explored anything with surrealism involved before. So I'll give you a little introduction to it, and then I will play the film. As always, it will be a separate link in the Blackboard if you have trouble hearing any audio on here, which I should make sure is all the way turned up. So it is a 1929 silent surrealist short film. It is directed and created by Louis Buñuel and Salvador Dali, who should be a familiar name. It was Buñuel's first film. It was only supposed to be like a sort of short film that they didn't have any expectations that it would be popular, but it did become really popular, and they ended up running it for 8 months. Now, some would say that the film has no plot, and it depends on your definition of plot, really. But the chronology of the film is kind of disjointed. You'll see it kind of jumps around, like I think it starts by saying once upon a time, and then it'll say 8 years later, but then the events and the characters don't really change very much. They're trying to use this dream logic, but in a sort of narrative flow. So essentially what they're doing is they're trying to use this Freudian free association, presenting a series of scenes that are kind of tenuously related. But anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about it after, but while you watch this film, I want you to think about what you're seeing and what your experience of time is, and do you think there's a plot? What do you think about all of this? Because if you haven't seen it before, it's probably different than anything you've ever experienced, even in films today. So let's get that up for you to watch. Okay, share screen. Okay, so here it is, Andalusian Dog, Un Chien Andalou, 1929. Okay, so let me get back to our screen here. Again, if we were in class, I would say, so what did you think? And we would have this wonderful discussion about Un Chien Andalou. However, we can't do that right now. So let me just give you a little background on the film, and then you sort of think about that for a little while. So the idea for this film kind of started when Louis Buñuel and Dali are at a restaurant one day, and they're talking about a dream that Buñuel had where there's this cloud that slices the moon in half, and he says, like a razor blade slicing through an eye. And then Dali told Buñuel that he had a dream about a hand that had ants crawling all over it. And so they both get very excited, and they're like, that's the film, we have to make it. And they were both sort of fascinated by what our human psyche can create in our dreams, and they decided to write a script based on the concept of suppressed human emotions. And so this is like in complete contrast to other filmmakers and artists working at this time. Most other filmmakers never left anything in their work to chance. Every single aesthetic decision has a rational explanation, and it fits into the whole. Buñuel, in his correspondence with Dali, makes it very clear that the only rule for writing their script was no idea or image that could lend itself to a rational explanation of any kind would be accepted. And then there's this quote from him where he says, nothing in the film symbolizes anything. The only method of investigation of the symbols would be perhaps psychoanalysis. So again, referring back to Freud. So throughout this whole film, you can kind of see, I mean, it seems like some weird dream or nightmare where some things are looping on themselves, or you get in this repetitiveness, and even the way that they're doing the sound, the music, that has a repetitiveness to it. So it almost like puts you in this dream state where you're like, oh, I could imagine that being a dream that I had. So I always feel like that's a really good way to get introduced to surrealism, by watching this film, because at this time a lot of artists were starting to use that as a medium to explore their message. So now we're going to talk about a couple different surrealist artists. Some mentioned in your text. The first one is Man Ray. He had some more like slightly purposeful works. He would experiment with the photogram. But he called them a rayograph because his last name is Ray. So here we have this photogram thing, right, that Talbot invented, and then many people have worked with over time. And you have Kristin Schad calling them shotographs, and you have Man Ray calling them rayographs, but they're all photograms. They're all the same, like here, the same sort of laying objects on photosensitive paper, exposing it to light, and then developing it. His rayographs were always untitled, but they featured all these different combinations of kind of mundane objects, some recognizable, some not. But like in this particular one, you can see the outline of a gun, you can see like stencils of letter tiles. So he's trying to do kind of a free association in a similar way that Buñuel and Dali were doing it in their film, but through these photograms. Next, we have Brassai, who he does these things called involuntary sculptures, which I just find incredibly charming. So here, I should show you them. Here's some of them. In 1932, he would collect and photograph this series of household items. Some of them are like bread, soap, toothpaste, little pieces of paper, but essentially things that you wouldn't consider sculpture, right? And the ones that I'm most drawn to are the ones like toothpaste and paper scraps, because he talks about how the paper scraps might come from his pocket. Like he's like it's a piece of garbage that he's been like twisting around in there, and then he pulls it out and sets it on the table and photographs it. And he calls that an involuntary sculpture, because if you're rolling paper or lint around in your pocket, you're not intending to make a sculptural work. But once you pull it out and you set it on the table and take a photograph of it and you say that is a sculpture, then it is, right? And the same thing with here, you can see there's a thimble and paper clips and little tacks and a seashell and different things that he's calling his involuntary sculptures. Also, it could be interpreted as things that don't want to be sculptures, but he's forcing them to be sculptures as well. So they're all shot kind of close up, magnified. They're presented completely out of context, and these sort of banal materials are reimagined as these kind of ready-made surrealist sculptures. And of course, once he photographs them, he throws them away. So there's no sort of value or preciousness to the actual object. He just takes the photograph and it lives on in that way. So there's a selection of these images that were published in this avant-garde magazine called Minotaur in 1933. You can see them. These are the ones here that were published as a photo essay, but more of a surrealist photo essay. And Dali had actually written the captions for each of the images there. And here's a close-up on one of them, so you can kind of see it a little bit better. But this would have been a little piece of paper that was involuntarily turned into a sculpture. And next we have Hans Bellmer. And your book doesn't dig too much into him, but I think that his work is a good measure of what some of the surrealists were doing. So I'm going to dig in a little bit more to him here. But there's topics like forbidden sensuality and sexuality that were frequently used in surrealist topics. And so Hans Bellmer met the Berlin Dadists while he was studying engineering, and eventually he moved to Paris and he met the Surrealists, and there he sort of found his home. And his work is all about this doll. And I have two images of it here, but there's many, many, many more if you Google him. But the doll, and this particular image of the doll, is a hand-colored black and white photograph. She's partially dismembered. She is a life-size doll sculpture that Bellmer built. Her construction is partly influenced by this opera by Jacques Offenbach called The Tales of Hoffmann. And that's basically, the opera is the story of a hero who falls in love with a realistic life-size mechanical doll. And so Bellmer was influenced by this opera and built his first doll in 1933 and a second in 1935. And this photograph is actually a picture of the second doll. The first doll was a different construction, wood, plaster, metal rods, nuts and bolts, and resembled more of a young girl. It embodied a lot of the qualities of what a surrealist object came to be known to have, which in this particular situation is subversive and erotic and sadistic and fetishistic. So what Bellmer would do is he would take a number of photographs of the doll in various poses, various stages of construction. You can see this one has 4 legs. You can see that this one is sort of deconstructed in a way and then almost reconstructed using the sort of broken down piece of furniture there. So these are just 2 examples. He has hundreds of these images, and the doll is always in like a different position, but also a different state of construction too. But 10 of these images were published with an accompanying text called Die Poupée in 1934, and then 18 of them were also published in that same surrealist publication, the Minotaur, that Brassai's Involuntary Sculptures were published in. But as he started making more and more and more photographs of the doll, the photographs became just as important as the sculpture itself because they carried this narrative function. They opened up this sort of new perspective on voyeuristic and fetishistic possibilities. As I said, he completed the second doll in 1935, photographed that one in all the different stages of dismemberment. He has over 100 scenarios. Oftentimes he's showing the sculpture wearing little white socks and black patent leather shoes of young girls, and this is where this starts to get slightly problematic, right? So with his doll sculptures and the photographs, Belmer's sort of appropriating and subverting the idea of a child's toy. And they sort of become this erotic obsession. The dolls incarnate his fascination for the corruption of innocence. And so there's, obviously there's some slightly problematic things with this man using this sculpture that's intended to represent a young girl. But there's two perspectives you can look at it from, and I have quotes from two art historians that I think make this very clear, and I'm going to share those with you. So the first one is from the art historian Hal Foster, and he writes that there was also this masochistic subtext in the doll photographs, and here is his quote. In his sadistic scenes, Belmer leaves behind masochistic trace in his erotic manipulation of the dolls. He explores a sadistic impulse that is also self-destructive. In this way, the dolls may go inside sadistic mastery to the point where the subject confronts its greatest fear, its own fragmentation and disintegration. So we're getting on the level of subconscious here and, talking about fears and, perhaps this is something that Belmer is working through in this project. And then we have the art historian Rosalind Krauss, who also describes Belmer's use of the doll imagery as a tactic. So she says, to produce the image of what one fears in order to protect oneself from what one fears. This is the strategic achievement of anxiety, which arms the subject in advance against the onslaught of trauma, the blow that takes one by surprise. So again, she's sort of suggesting that he's working through some trauma by executing this project here. And, at first glance and, without hearing this sort of analysis of the work, you might be like, oh my God, this guy's a total creep, which maybe he is. But art historians try to frame it in a context that makes sense. With a purpose. So these ideas of fear and fragmentation and disintegration and trauma are all present topics within Belmer's work, whether he's specifically saying that or not, but it's all coming from his subconscious and coming out through the sculptures themselves and the photographs. Next, we have Raoul Ubach. He was with the Surrealists during the 1930s, and his photographs would also appear in the Minotaur publication. There's all these efforts in Surrealism to kind of tap into the creative powers of the subconscious and lead everyone through the landscape of dreams and chance and sexual fantasy and madness. And, photography is essentially a realist medium, yet you can see through what we've looked at here with the Surrealists, it has this power to kind of distort appearances and was appreciated for its sort of unique ability to force a rupture in the surface of this perceived reality. And so what Ubach was doing is he would use a method called solarization, and any of you who have done a darkroom photography class before might have experimented with this, but essentially what you do is, well, there's two ways you can do it. One of them is you can, after you've taken your photographs on your roll film, you can open the back of the camera, expose the film to light, and then close it right away. Or you can print your negative on your paper in the darkroom and then take it out into the light really quickly and then back into the darkroom. And essentially you're just letting light on things that aren't technically supposed to have light on them until they've been processed through the chemistry. But what it does is it causes this slight reversal of tones, especially along the edges of objects. And that's what you're looking at here is a solarized image from Ubach. Sometimes it's called edge reversal, but it's very unpredictable, which made it very sort of attractive to the surrealists, because it was all about that sort of free association, like what's in the subconscious, like we need to do things we can't control to like see what else can happen. And so Ubach also developed this technique called brûlage, or burning, in which he would melt his film, before, not completely obviously, but he would melt it in a way so that he would produce these kind of like swirling shapes when he made his prints. So they're using also, similar to the pictorialists, some hand work in these images as well. Okay, so male surrealist painters and photographers would often use female forms, as you've seen, as symbols of something primitive or mysterious or erotic. Men have done this for all of time and still do today. And, you know, there's feminist critics kind of point out that these male surrealists are always picturing the woman's body as in a cage or distorted or dismembered, as in Belmer's doll, as if the woman needs to be trapped or observed or punished in some way. And that's kind of a bonkers way to go, but you know, different times, and the women in the surrealist movement didn't generally like align with this way of, you know, the men using their bodies. So this is Dora Maar. She was a painter first, and typically throughout history, she's only ever referenced as like one of Picasso's many lovers. And she's also a subject of a lot of his paintings. But she was also in tight with Man Ray and his circle, and she was also an experimental photographer who made her own images. And as you can see in this portrait here, she is the original person to use tiny hands. If you look at the bottom of the image here, she was the OG there. So here's one of her photographs called Pere Ubu from 1936, and it's just a baby armadillo, but it's got this very alienistic quality in the way the photograph is made. It has that experimental sort of dreamlike aspect to it that, you know, this could be something in your nightmare, you know, in your dreams. And then she has images like this as well, using the multiple exposure technique. And then we have Claude Cahun. And Claude was an activist, writer, and photographer. She was with the Surrealists in the 30s as well, although this photograph was made in 1928. And I don't know, pronouns were not a thing that were considered in the 1920s and 30s. This is all actually a very recent, or, you know, the last 20 or 30 years. So I don't know what Claude's preference for pronoun would be, so I'm going to refer to her as her and she. But she made self-portraits that were kind of exploring these shifting subjective moments and female gender identity. So Claude was actually born with the name Lucy Renee Matilda Schwab, and later on changed her first name to Claude, which in French can be either male or female. So it's a non-gendered name. And so she worked for herself. She had no desire to be famous. It really wasn't until like 40 years after she died that her work started to actually become recognized. And in many ways, her life was marked by this sense of role reversal, and her public identity became a commentary on the public's notions of sexuality and gender and beauty and logic. And her adoption of a sexually ambiguous name and her sort of androgynous self-portraits display this very revolutionary way of thinking and creating and experimenting with her audience's understanding of photography as a documentation of reality. She also was a poet, and her poetry also took on challenging gender roles and really attacked the increasingly modern world's social and economic boundaries. Um, so her participation in the Parisian Surrealist movement diversified the group's work and ushered in some new representations that, I hope you can see from what we've looked at so far, is very different from everyone else's work. Where most Surrealist artists were men and their primary images were of women as these isolated symbols of eroticism, Claude epitomizes this sort of chameleonic and multiple possibilities of genders and of the body. And her photographs and writings and general life as an artistic and political revolutionary continue to influence countless artists today. The two that I'll share with you now is the work of Cindy Sherman, who we'll discuss more down the road, and the work of Nan Goldin. And this is going to be like when we get more into the 70s, the 1970s. But their work is heavily and strongly influenced by Claude Cahun. Next, we have Andre Kertész. He was involved with the Surrealist movement, but not as heavily as some of the others. But he did focus on this surrealist distortion of the human figure, which sort of brings up some of those problematics that I was talking about with males using females' bodies. But he was commissioned for this that we're looking at here, called Distortion, in 1933, and there's about 200 photos of these two models portrayed nude in different poses. You're catching their reflection. These two here, you don't actually see their bodies. You only see the reflections in the mirror. But this one, you can kind of see. It's more of an in progress shot. He's using these mirrors that are kind of similar to like if you went to a fun house at a carnival or a fair and you go in the house of mirrors. So he's using all these different curved mirrors to create these shapes. But his stuff is more on par with men using women's bodies to make their art, and not using it in a way that seems respectful, because when you're distorting a woman's body like this, it's dehumanizing in a way. And but then you also have to get on the level with the surrealists, and they're trying to think of like dreams and nightmares and memories and the subconscious, and these are totally things like the reflection in the mirror here is totally something I would see in a dream. So there's that too. Finally, we cannot end this without talking about Henri Cartier-Bresson for just a brief moment. So he was more influenced by the surrealist theories of like irrational things than he was by their actual art practice. So the photograph of his that I'm going to show you you're going to be like, oh, that's really different. But he's more taking influence from their theories as opposed to their visual methods of working. But he worked with this thought of spontaneous expression, and he was very focused on intuition, and instead of like the Dadaists and the Surrealists kind of had this attitude of like revolting against something and being disruptive and working towards change. He was a little bit more he wasn't so focused on that. He was more interested in photography itself. But he is kind of legendary for describing the way that he makes these very spontaneous images that he does. He calls them the decisive moment. And really what it is he sits and waits for the right moment to take the photograph. And the one in the slide here is probably the most famous example of one of his images. There's this man who appears to be suspended over this large puddle. And Bresson waited for this image, as he does with many of his images, and had he clicked the shutter a second later, this man would have splashed into the puddle and we would have a very different image. But his work was about that sort of patience, spontaneity, intuition and waiting. If you look at a series of his images, they're just all like, wow, like he captured that at just the right moment. So there's something to be said. Also, the fact that he's working with film. When you're using a digital camera, you can snap, 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 snap. With a film camera in the 1920s and 30s, you had one shot if you were getting a spontaneous image. There wouldn't be time to, because you have to press the shutter, you have to advance the film, and then you have to go back and take the next image. So it's not as fast. And I don't think it's until the 80s that we get automatic film advancement in cameras. Maybe in the 70s, some like very expensive cameras would have it, but this is kind of how it works for quite some time here. So the fact that he could capture images like this just with his sort of intuitiveness about the photographic images is pretty incredible. So that kind of finishes our discussion about surrealism. The last thing I want to talk about, and I know this one's getting long, but we're almost done, is the California Modern and the group F64. So the Dadaists and Surrealists they're mostly working in Europe, right? There's some in the United States, but we mostly just talked about Switzerland, Germany, and France, right? But so around the same time that the Dadaists and Surrealists are working, there's this other group that starts to be developed in California. And in the United States, the pictorialist movement is kind of still lingering around a little bit, but there is this group of photographers that start calling themselves Group F64. And their manifesto, which is much shorter than the Surrealist and the Dadaist manifesto, is, I've put it on your screen here so that you can see it, but I'll read it out loud as well. The members of Group F64 believe that photography as an art form must develop along lines defined by the actualities and limitations of the photographic medium, and must always remain independent of ideological conventions of art and aesthetics that are reminiscent of a period and culture antedating the growth of the medium itself. So, Group F64, they're totally over pictorialism. They're sort of like, it's had its time, we have to do something new and different. In a similar way to how the Dadaists and the Surrealists were wanting to move into the future separate of the past, right? So all three of these movements kind of align together in that sentiment, even though aesthetically and politically they've got different motives and goals. But the thing about the Group F64 is that some of its members had actually previously been practicing as pictorialists. So I always think that might make them, more knowledgeable about why it's time to dismiss it and move on. And of course, within this group, they wanted to encourage the exploration of the vision of the camera. And so some of you might be wondering, well, what does F64 mean? Like, what does that mean? So it refers to the little lens opening on their large format cameras that produced very clear detail in the foreground as well as the background, and indicates that they had, kind of more in common with regard to the appearance of the photograph than necessarily its subject matter. And we are going to discuss a few members of the group in a moment here, but I first have to go into this conversation about my charts. So those of you who are photographers or taking classes in photography might know some of this already, but we have a diverse class with lots of different folks. So I like to go through some charts to help people understand kind of what the F64 stands for. So it's aperture, that's the formal name. And I like this image here because they're showing you actual lenses from a camera. And on the one that's labeled f1.8, you can see that the aperture is all the way open. The lens is all the way open. So it's open wide, but the number is small. And when we go all the way over to f22, that opening is really tiny, but the number is big. Now, if you look at how tiny f22 is, You can imagine how tiny f64 is. It's essentially a pinprick. Like you can't even see it, but it's open enough. So what does that mean? What does that do? So when you have a large aperture like f2.8, small number, large aperture, you're going to have a very shallow depth of field. So what that means is that if I'm taking a photograph of you and I'm using an f2.8, the only thing likely in focus in that image is going to be like the tip of your nose. Everything else will be blurry. Or if I focus on your ear, your face and the background will all be blurry, but your ear will be in focus. As you stop down to medium and small aperture, the depth of field grows. So if you're at an f22, almost everything will be in focus in your image. If you're at an f64, everything's in focus. It's an infinity focus. So that once we start looking at the examples of images, I think you'll see like how crisp and clear, and all of these photographers in this group used f64. They didn't use any other f-stop or aperture. It also, can affect your exposure, right? So here's an example. All of these photographs here were taken at the same shutter speed. So the shutter went as fast on each one of these images, but they all have a different exposure, right? The f1.2 is really bright, the f22 is really dark. So that kind of shows that if you're shooting at f22, you have to increase your shutter, or decrease your shutter speed in order to get more light in to increase your exposure time. So f1.2 is kind of washed out, right? So this is kind of how you run like a test of images to see like what your exposure needs to be. I have a lot of these charts just because I think certain, everyone learns differently. So some of these have like little images, like for example, at the bottom of this one, these squares that have the little person in the house is a really nice representation of what I was just talking about with depth of field. So in the one that's in the f1.4 column, you have the figure is in focus, but everything else is blurry. And then as we move to smaller and smaller aperture, we see more things come into focus. All right. And then this is like the last chart. This one's the most complicated, and we probably won't talk about all the elements here, but this one has your apertures aligned with the depth of fields, and then also includes shutter speed and ISO. And I mean, we don't need to understand those things for this class. I think the most important thing to understand for group f64 is the aperture and the depth of field is significant. But it is good to know that because the aperture is so small, the exposures would take some time often, depending on the lighting situation. So to get into our photographers, we're going to talk about 3 of them from the group: Imogen Cunningham, Ansel Adams, and Edward Weston. So first we have Imogen. And you should remember her from the reading because she did do some work with the pictorialists. She started, and here's an example of one of her pictorialist images. She began by making these sort of portraits and story-like images, kind of similar to Julia Margaret Cameron. And you can see clearly from the aesthetics of this photograph that she's working with this pictorialist toolkit, right? It's blurry, it's soft, it's dreamlike, it's even titled Dream. So this is kind of where she started. And then she moved to California, she met Edward Weston, and her work started to change. So she abandons this work with pictorialism and her fuzzy graphs for more straightforward photography. What she starts working with, she has a couple subjects. She has these nude studies that she does, and again, these are all being taken with the f64 aperture. so everything's in focus. But she does a lot of nude studies. She does close-ups of plants. And a lot of her flower portraits that she did were compared to the paintings that Georgia O'Keeffe was doing around the same time. So this is one of Imogen's flower portraits, and this is one of Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings. So you can see how those two are kind of working with a similar vibe here. And then as we move into her later years, so she worked with the F64, Group F64 for some time, but then of course, as you grow as an artist, you can't just take pictures of the same thing over and over and over, because not only does that get boring for you, but it gets boring for your viewers. And so this is her project from 1976. It's portraits of older people, and she was actually one of the first to photograph older people in a way that respected their individuality, right? There's a way that she keeps this from being exploitative or voyeuristic, and you can see that this woman's looking right at you. She's looking right at the camera. She's addressing it unapologetically. And so this is Irene Bobby Library, and it's from Imogen's book called After 90. And if you have an opportunity to check it out from the library, I recommend taking a look at it. Or even if you don't want to check it out, go take a look at it at the library, because it's a beautiful book. But that's sort of the arc of Imogen Cunningham. And then, of course, we have Ansel Adams. He's the best known of the Group F64. He says this thing, though, that kind of drives me nuts. He says, "I still believe there is real social significance in a rock, a more important significance therein than a line of unemployed." Okay, so your book will say that this was about his true belief in the spiritual value of nature to society. But what he's commenting on here is the folks who were photographing for social reform, and we're going to get more into that next week. But really, what he's doing is very different, but he's kind of like judging these people working on a totally different platform with this quote. And so I just like to call that out, because it bugs me. I'm like, you can't compare the social significance of a rock to, when you're doing nature photography and like the exploration of camera vision, to people who are making photographs as propaganda for governmental change, So again, some of these white guys just think they're being poetic, but they really just sound stupid. Anyways, so Adams was a full-time photographer. He photographed throughout California's Yosemite National Park area. He actually developed something called the zone system, which I'm going to flip to in a second. But you can see from this image here, like every single thing's in focus, from the trees in the foreground to the clouds in the sky. Like that's what that F64 does. It gives you infinity focus, and it gives you the most flexibility with your tones and your exposures, and there's just so much room to make them the most beautiful images this way. But here's an example of a chart associated with this zone system he developed, and essentially what it does is it gives you kind of a system to follow so that you can pre-visualize the finished print by comparing the light intensities that you're seeing with the chart that you have here. And there's different versions of this chart. This is not the best one, but it's good enough for what we're chatting about here. But what this does is it gives you kind of a range of tones from black to white. And the purpose of this zone system, and what I'm trying to say here, is that the main work of making the picture would take place not in the darkroom, but before the film was processed. Basically, the school of thought was the more work you did in camera before the shot was taken, the less work you would have to do in the darkroom. And if you think about it, this was a big deal. First of all, Film photography did not allow you to see the image like digital cameras do today. And so this meant that you had to rely on your knowledge and your skill of light and the camera apparatus to generate a usable negative. Now, historically, when I've taught film photography, I always encourage my students to do as much work in camera as possible. Not only does this save frames on the film, which is incredibly expensive these days, by the way, but it also saves you a lot of work in the darkroom, right? Like if you take a photograph that you haven't carefully thought through your aperture settings, your shutter speed, your ISO, like all of these things, even on a digital camera, then you have to go into Photoshop and do all this work. It's the same thing with a darkroom. You have to go into the darkroom and do all of this burning and dodging and fixing your exposure, and like that's even more labor than doing it in Photoshop, because Photoshop has algorithms that can help you. This is all done by hand, so you can imagine the sort of amount of work you could spend in a darkroom if you didn't take the time to make your image perfectly the first time. And when I teach digital, it's the same thing. Like there's nothing fun about taking like 600 images and then having to pick out the best 5 or 10 to kind of edit from. Like that's just exhausting. But if you focus on what you're doing in the camera, you can get a quite close to perfect exposure, and then you have very little post production work to do at that point. So essentially what I'm saying is if everything is exposed and framed perfectly in the image on the negative or in your digital camera, then all you have to do in the darkroom is expose a perfect print and you're done. Which I mean is a skill you have to develop, just like learning how to use Photoshop, but I think you understand what I'm saying here. So finally, we're almost done, yay. Edward Weston. So he's another one of the more famous members of the F64 group. And his sort of quote that he says is, "The finished print is provisioned on the ground glass while focusing. The shutter's release fixes forever these values and forms." So like Adams, he believed in working in camera to create the perfect image as opposed to editing in the darkroom. So Weston has some beautiful subjects that he works with. Some of his most iconic are his seashells, which you see here, and his peppers, which I've seen live in person, and they are incredible. And then he also has these strange contorted nude forms. He sort of cropping the body in a way that sort of indicates more landscape than anything else. And oftentimes folks will say that his other subject, sand dunes, that the sand dunes and the peppers appear more sensual than the ones of the human figure that he does. And I agree with that. But he worked with this style that portrayed these objects very close up with extremely sharp detail. Again, like the others in the group, the only f-stop they use is f64. The pepper photographs were actually taken in complete darkness, and he left the shutter open for hours and hours and hours. So you can kind of see we've come full circle here from, Niepce working to get that first photograph, and it's got this 8-hour exposure, and it's so laborious, and he finally gets it. And then from there, we're working towards, we need the shutter speeds to be faster. We need the materials to be more sensitive so that we can arrest motion. Well, now we've gone through all of these, with the futurists and the pictorialists wanting to include movement and blur, and then you've got the group F64 who's like, no, we want to slow this down, and we want really long exposures to get as much detail and tonality as possible. Like, this is a roller coaster here that we're going through, but it's fascinating. So that's pretty much it. That's all I wanted to talk about today. I know this was a long one. I hope that you if you watch it all in one sitting, I'm sorry, but I hope that maybe you took a break. As always, the the video for the Un Chien Andalou and the link to Eric Solomon's photographs will be on the Blackboard, as well as your assignments will be there too. So if you have questions about anything that I've discussed today, please let me know. Take care, and I will see you next time.